Tonight, I'll give you an overview of Parker Hitt's career and a taste of my biography of Hitt. Hitt was famous in his time, but is largely unknown today. His name appeared in the newspaper for his deeds in the Philippines and in World War I, yet history has largely forgotten him. This picture is my favorite of Hitt, sitting on his porch at Fort Leavenworth. In the background is a picture of his first cipher device. Now, Hitt did not consider himself a cryptologist. He considered himself an infantry soldier. Even after his success as Chief Signal Officer of the AEF First Army during World War I, he made the decision to stay infantry rather than switch to signals. Cryptologic historians have tended to discount his role in early 20th century cryptology, apart from his book, The Manual for Solution of Military Ciphers, though David Kahn sang Hitt's praises in his book, The Codebreakers. No one had previously examined his entire career to understand his true contributions to cryptology and indeed what he did for the Army at large. Next slide, please. My first week on the job at the Center for Cryptologic History was in October 2007. It was the week of the 2007 Cryptologic History Symposium. Dr. Dave Hatch, the NSA historian, gave a talk which mentioned Parker Hitt. My first thought was to wonder if he was related to my husband, who has a Hitt line, and indeed he is. My husband is Parker Hitt's fourth cousin, twice removed. So I started researching Parker, looking for where he was buried, and I couldn't find him. And I say I looked for where he's buried because I'm a long-time genealogist. I've been doing genealogy since I was very young. So that was my first thought. Where are they buried? Work backwards. A former colleague of mine lived near Front Royal, where the Hitts had lived in retirement, and I asked him if he could poke around. And that is how in late 2008, early 2009, I was connected to the Warren County Heritage Society because the director there had been asked years earlier to assist a family with organizing a trunk of Hitt's papers. Now, these people, the Mormon family, had bought land from Hitt's daughter, Mary Lou, in the 1970s, and they became friends. And their daughter grew up swimming in the Hitt's pool and playing in their yard. And when Mary Lou died, the family inherited her estate. And the daughter and her husband now live in the Hitt house. And actually, the property has recently been put up for sale in the past month. So if you have $1.3 million and an interest in 93 acres right near the entrance to Skyline Drive, it's a really nice piece of land. Check out Zillow. So I was allowed to tour the house and I was given access to the trunk and all its contents and other materials. And it was a real gold mine for a historian. Next slide, please. The clue to Hitt's importance to modern cryptology comes in a dedication the great cryptologist William F. Friedman wrote in Hitt's copy of the Friedman's book, The Shakespearean Ciphers Examined. Friedman says Hitt is the father of modern American military cryptology. In an earlier letter to Hitt, thanking him for a signed picture, Friedman said Hitt was the father of cryptanalysis in the American Army. So you see here a picture of the Friedmans, William and Elizabeth, both cryptologists, at the time their book was released in the 1950s, and a photo of their inscription. Friedman is one of the greatest cryptologists of the 20th century. He's the man who led the Army Signal Intelligence Service to its breakthroughs against Japanese cipher machines and the de facto grandfather of the National Security Agency. So it's Friedman who's usually thought of as the father of American cryptology, but Friedman attributes a lot of that work to Hitt. Why? Well, William and Elizabeth Friedman, when tasked with teaching cipher work to military officers at Riverbank Laboratories in late 1917 and 1918, used Hitt's manual as their course guide, and they were keeping a chapter ahead of their students as they themselves learned the discipline. Friedman's respect for Hitt was so great that in late 1944, he expedited a job for Hitt's daughter Mary Lou at Arlington Hall Station. Mary Lou, after having tea with Friedman, wrote to her parents, saying, quote, "I give you my word that the lowliest lieutenant stepping within the gates is taught about pop first, and then, much later, about his own particular duties and God." Was Friedman right about Hitt? Let's take a look at Hitt's career. Next slide, please. These pictures are Hitt as a baby in 1878, a toddler about 1880, and as a young man, but the date is unknown. Hitt was born into a middle-class, politically and socially active family in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1878. His father, George Cooper Hitt, was the business manager of the Indianapolis Journal and the first publisher for the Hoosier poet James Whitcomb Riley. In his youth, George served as a secretary for one of the early Army expeditions exploring Yellowstone. His mother left her Massachusetts home to become a physical education teacher at an Omaha, Nebraska high school. The couple met in Omaha. George's older brother Wilbur was a Civil War veteran and an avid outdoorsman, and Parker learned a lot from him. George Hitt had a small role in the presidential campaign of Benjamin Harrison, and as a matter of fact, George and Parker traveled on Harrison's inaugural train to Washington when Parker was 10. It would turn out that in his lifetime, Parker attended 2 presidential inaugurations, but we'll get to that later. When Parker was 12, George became vice consul general to his friend and Indianapolis Journal owner John C. New at the U.S. Embassy in London. New's son, Harry, who has also worked at the paper, would later become a U.S. senator and then postmaster general. So you see, Parker was very well connected with Indianapolis politicians and movers and shakers. He attended the University College School in London while the family was there, and then upon his return to Indianapolis in early 1892, the 13-year-old Hitt joined the freshman class at Indianapolis High School No. 1, a coeducational, racially integrated school, which was later renamed Shortridge High School. I believe Kurt Vonnegut also graduated from Shortridge, much after Hitt. Hitt had just turned 17 when he entered Purdue University as part of the class of 1899. Here he majored in civil engineering and participated in the Cadet Corps, which of course is the predecessor of the ROTC. He was a straight A student, and according to the university's president, a young man of fine personal character and of conduct and habit above reproach, as well as rather mature in his judgments, with, what is rare, a good deal of common sense. Next slide, please. In the summer of 1898, having completed his junior year, Hitt abruptly left Purdue and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He tried for a commission, but he was not yet 21, so he didn't get selected despite passing all the exams for an engineering officer. He was mustered into the 2nd U.S. Volunteer Engineers as a sergeant on July 1st, the day of the battles of San Juan Hill and El Caney in Cuba. But he did not get to Cuba until the end of the year, after helping to build Camp Wyckoff at Montauk Point, Long Island, a quarantine camp for returning soldiers. In Cuba, he helped construct Camp Columbia in Havana and was mustered out in April 1899, determined to become a commissioned officer. And that's a picture of Hitt in Cuba. Next slide, please. This picture is his commissioning picture in the fall of 1899. And with some help from a family friend, Senator Charles W. Fairbanks, he achieved his goal, and at the end of 1899 set off as a 2nd lieutenant to serve his first tour in the Philippines. Next slide, please. Actually, yeah, that's fine. Next slide is fine. Hitt had 2 tours in the Philippines with the 22nd Infantry, separated by a period of home service. During his first tour, he was stationed on Luzon, where he won fame for his February 1901 encounter with a band carrying messages for Philippine President Emilio Aguinaldo, the picture on the left. Hitt's men were poised to surround and capture the group, and Hitt ordered his men to hold their fire. But as he wrote later, one of his men had his finger too close to the trigger and a rifle crack to the left. So Hitt gave the order to fire, and after 3 volleys, they found most of the band had fled up the mountain pass, abandoning food, ammunition, and a pack of more than 200 letters. The capture of this group when they reached the other side of the mountain, shortly after Hitt's engagement, resulted in the discovery of enciphered messages. General Frederick Funston broke these messages, and that led to the capture of Aguinaldo himself. Hitt did not have anything to do with breaking these messages and never claimed to have done so, although others, including David Kahn, claim that Hitt broke the messages, but clearly Hitt didn't even know they existed till much later in his career. Later in 1901, he was the officer who located and recovered the remains of the Navy seaman Denzel Venville, an action for which he was commended by the Secretary of the Navy. Venville was part of a party from the USS Yorktown, which had been ambushed in April 1899. Hitt's unit received information from some prisoners that enabled them to locate Venville's partial remains. They constructed a rock pyramid and cross and cut an inscription on a tree to mark the place. On the right is the sketch and map Hitt prepared of the site. Venville's story, if you're interested, is discussed in great detail in a book called The Devil's Causeway by Matthew Westphal. On Luzon, Hitt developed sciatica and rheumatism after a typhoon in October 1901. These ailments would bother him for the rest of his life, but did not impair his ability to serve. Next slide, please. Okay. Hitt's second tour was on Mindanao, where he received a Silver Star for gallantry for an attack on Moro forts on the Taraka River in April 1904. It was said he vied with other junior officers to be the first to land, while fearlessly exposing themselves to fire. The picture on the left was taken shortly after that engagement. I've highlighted Hitt in pale green. The battle aggravated his hip and his leg problems, and as a result, he was put in charge of Army water transportation on Lake Lanao, gaining a reputation as the Admiral of Lake Lanao. And there's a little song written there, unknown author, unknown artist, song by General Hitt. It's not entirely impossible that Hitt did that himself. He was a bit of an artist. And while on Lake Lanao, he assisted in raising Spanish gunboats from the lake floor using his engineering ability. He used the small lake fleet to transport troops and engage in amphibious warfare. Hitt kept a diary from 1901 to 1906, which is fairly matter-of-fact. It was useful for checking dates, but while in the Philippines, he didn't really expand on his experiences in battle, although it was useful for dates, places, what he was reading, his hunting trips, and the results of baseball games. Later in life, he wrote several articles which were more explicit about his combat experience. Next slide, please. This picture was taken on the range at Laguna Seca, California. Hitt is behind the gun, and it's believed to be testing his invention of a water cooling system for the machine gun that used a hose he stole from the bathroom in the barracks. After the Philippines, Hitt remained in the 22nd Infantry, which was stationed in California. He was at Point Bonita for a while on the range and this is where he learned about telephony, helping run telephone cables on the range. He briefly supervised a refugee camp in San Francisco after the April 1906 earthquake, and then he attended the newly established School of Musketry at the Presidio of Monterey, where he developed expertise in all aspects of machine gun work and stayed on at the school as an unofficial teaching assistant. Some of his work and his range findings were used by Captain John Henry Machine Gun Parker in his writings. Parker's writings used Parker Hitt's work. He also invented a device to water cool machine guns and participated in the Army deployment to the mine strike at Goldfield, Nevada. Now, this picture I think came from the National Archives. It was a good find. So, next slide, please. Hitt then led a company at Fort Davis in Nome, Alaska. He brought radio equipment with him to Alaska because he had gotten interested in radio, taught himself about how radio worked, and spent time with nearby Signal Corps troops and those at the Army radio station at Safety. He began to dream of attending the signal school, but he was interested in aviation rather than signaling, and of course, aviation was under the Signal Corps at the time. In 1910, 12 years into what was a fairly typical infantry career, Hitt moved with the 22nd to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, where his life would change. By the time he left Texas, he had transferred to the 10th Infantry, hoping for a slot in the School of the Line, which he couldn't get with the 22nd. He then came back as part of the Maneuver Division in the spring of 1911, and he participated at that time in a small short aviation program, flying one of the Wright machines twice. He was finally promoted to captain, and while in San Antonio, he met and married a woman named Genevieve Young. He didn't get the School of the Line, but was sent to the Signal School instead. Next slide. I'm going to give you a little background on Genevieve Young. These pictures go left to right about age 6, an unknown date. The third one is possibly a wedding picture. And the last one on the right is Parker. And the only picture I know of the young Parker and Genevieve together at Fort Leavenworth when she was pregnant with Mary Lou, so in 1912. So Genevieve Young was a doctor's daughter who was raised in San Antonio, Texas. She had always vowed not to marry an Army officer, but admitted, "I didn't know Parker Hitt then." The two met in the autumn of 1910, just before Hitt's transfer to the 10th Infantry became official, and with that his move to Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis. When Parker returned to San Antonio in March 1911 to participate in the maneuver division, the newly promoted captain renewed his courtship in earnest. He proposed in May, and the two married quietly in July. After a honeymoon in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and a visit to Hitt's family in Indiana, the newlyweds arrived at Fort Leavenworth in August 1911. Genevieve had a good secondary education and an aptitude for bridge, which is often an indicator for cryptologic talent. She seems to have enjoyed learning about codes and ciphers that Hitt studied at the school. By 1916, she was assisting with cryptanalytic problems sent to Hitt from Washington. She rather underrated her own work, but when Parker went to France in World War I, it was Genevieve and their daughter Mary Lou who traveled to Riverbank Laboratories to instruct its staff, including William and Elizabeth Friedman, in the use of Hitt's sliding strip device and to talk about his book, The Manual. She offered her services to Ralph Van Diemen, head of military intelligence, who said he'd keep her in mind, and then she went to live in San Antonio for the duration of the war. But by August 1917, the Southern Department was routinely sending Genevieve intercepted messages to solve, and this was on an unpaid basis, and she did the work at home. In April 1918, she was hired by the Southern Department's intelligence officer to be a code clerk. While the job primarily involved coding and decoding official messages, Genevieve continued to break messages intercepted by radio or postal censorship. In May 1918, she was actually sent TDY to visit MI8 in Washington, where she had discussions with Herbert O. Yardley and Dr. Edith Rickert. Genevieve resigned her job after the armistice and never worked in cryptology again. But when the Hitts lived in Washington in 1920, she briefly worked as a document indexer for J. Edgar Hoover at the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI, but she left that job shortly after Parker was promoted. In July 1940, she again offered her services to the FBI, but they decided she would not be of any, quote, material assistance in any emergency situation, and they did not act on hiring her. Despite her short time in the world of work, her death certificate lists her occupation as retired code and cipher expert. That, of course, was Parker's doing. Next slide, please. September 1911 to June 1915 was a period of great productivity and inventiveness for Hitt, who was first a student and then an instructor and sometimes temporary director at the Army's Signal School at Fort Leavenworth. He invented both cylinder and strip cipher devices, built a portable telephone switchboard, which would be used during World War I, and spent several stints on the Mexican border. He was also identified as an Army cipher expert, a, quote, shark on ciphers. Washington sent him Mexican messages to break. Genevieve worked on these messages with him, and by the way, she became the first woman to break ciphers for the U.S. government, even though she wasn't being paid for it. This picture shows the first iteration of Hitt's cylinder, which did not contain mixed alphabets. It was really just straight alphabets straight off the old Army cipher disk. He later developed a set of alphabets, which Friedman called the star cipher, and in 1913 modified the device. Joseph O. Moburn, who was an instructor at the Signal School as well, who would later become chief signal officer, built a stronger, more random set of alphabets and created a device called the M94 on the lower right. He created that in 1918 using stamped metal, as Hitt had proposed, and this device was formally introduced to the Army and used in both the Army and Navy and the State Department well into the 1950s. Next slide, please. In the spring of 1914, using the principles of a cylinder cipher, Hitt built a strip cipher. The first model was about 7 by 4 inches and had 20 numbered sliding strips, each with a different mixed alphabet. His next version was 2 frames wide for 40 strips. On the left is the 1916 model, created for Genevieve. They each had one, so they could use it for telegrams when they were separated. Though I've not found any examples of that use. And that particular device is in the collection at Fort Huachuca. Genevieve demonstrated this device to the staff at Riverbank Laboratories in 1917 and to Herbert O. Yardley in the spring of 1918 because she was hoping Yardley would approve the device for use within the Southern Department for communications with Mexico City because the code had been compromised. Yardley, of course, rejected the idea, saying a new code was coming out, but the code didn't come out till much later. In 1938, William Friedman directed the construction of a strip cipher device with 25 strips. That was the M138, which is pictured on the right. The Navy's version was called the CSP-845. Both devices were inspired by and derived from Hitt's work. Next slide, please. Hitt's inventiveness was not confined to cipher devices. Among his many ideas were, this is the 40-line portable switchboard, which packs up in a suitcase. This is the camp switchboard, which was used during World War I at division level. Battery testing devices. He made improvements to the 1912 service buzzer. He adapted a formula relating to signals to an easy-to-use chart so people didn't have to do the math. He made improvements to signal lanterns, and he probably did many other things that are not mentioned in the files. He was the kind of person who just tinkered with stuff and made inventions and kept an idea book that he let students use. Next slide, please. Hitt's cipher work and the lack of a standard text on codes and ciphers at the school led him to prepare his Manual for the Solution of Military Ciphers, which remained a standard work for the Army through World War II. It was meant to be a textbook for the signal school and included a set of principles for establishing a code and cipher breaking effort, which are the first documented thoughts for an Army signals intelligence operation. In a discussion of equipment for cipher work, Hitt emphasizes the importance of each field army having an office where all ciphers intercepted should be sent at once for examination. He places this work within the Army's intelligence section. He suggests that a special radio station with receiving instruments only should be adjunct to this office, and its function should be to copy all hostile radio messages, whether in cipher or plain text. And he states that this facility should operate 24 hours a day. Hitt, writing in 1915, was describing a signal intelligence system that would not exist in the U.S. Army for some time. Though he spent years at the signal school, he was still an infantry officer on detail. He did not move to the Signal Corps when his time was up in 1915 and went to be an instructor at the new School of Musketry at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, transferring to the 19th Infantry. It was while he spent some time on border duty during the punitive expedition that Hitt met a young lieutenant who had become a lifelong friend. That was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Next slide, please. These pictures on the left, Hitt sitting on the back steps of the First Army Telegraph trailer in Souy, France during the Meuse-Argonne campaign, and on the right, his formal portrait as CSO of the First Army. In May 1917, there was a fight for Hitt's services. Ralph Van Diemen, in charge of the small military intelligence operation in Washington, wanted Hitt to head a cipher bureau, and on May 17th ordered Hitt to report to him in Washington. However, Hitt's old mentor, the former director of the Signal School, General Edgar Russell, had been chosen by Pershing to be the AEF's chief signal officer. Russell knew he wanted Hitt as his assistant and had orders telegraphed under Pershing's signature, and they arrived the same day. So Hitt packed up from Fort Sill and did not know where he knew he was going to Washington. He didn't know what he was going to be doing. He had two sets of orders. On his first day in Washington, he and Russell went to see Van Diemen, and Van Diemen was furious. Van Diemen called the Adjutant General's office to protest Hitt being taken by Pershing. Russell and Hitt rushed back across town to Pershing's office, where Pershing also got upset, saying, quote, "God damn the General Staff, my staff goes with me," as he stormed out to find Acting Army Chief of Staff Tasker Bliss. So Van Diemen eventually settled for State Department Code Clerk Herbert O. Yardley to run what became MI8. Hitt sailed on the RMS Baltic with Pershing's staff as an assistant to Russell. In France, Hitt and Russell laid the groundwork for all the communications needed by the AEF, liaised with the British and the French, and came up with both the idea for the AEF Signal Corps Research and Inspection Division and for the use of female telephone operators in France, the Hello Girls. There were three parts to cryptology in the AEF in France, and I'm sorry I don't have a slide breaking them out, but basically you have collecting signals, including conducting direction finding. Then you have breaking codes and cipher messages and passing intelligence on within the G2, and cryptography, making new codes and ciphers for AEF use. Two of these functions, collection and cryptography, were traditionally Signal Corps duties, and Hitt had some involvement in these in the course of his normal work. The breaking of codes and ciphers was done in the G2A6, which was run by a former star pupil of Hitt's at the Signal School, Captain, later Colonel Frank Moorman. Hitt assisted all three parts of the operation, but most particularly the code compilation section. It was Hitt's alarm at the simplicity of the section's first attempt at a trench code that led to a famous test, which was Herbert O'Yardley discussed in his book, The American Black Chamber, though he was erroneous about a lot about it. This test was set up using an officer from the G2A6 and the code, and this test led to creation of a more secure trench code, what became known as the Rivers and Lakes codes. Hitt undertook other cryptologic duties, which are discussed in my book, but there are too many to go into tonight. The AEF Signal Corps moved away from headquarters in Chaumont in the spring of 1918, but Hitt stayed behind, sort of acting as Russell's eyes and ears. He split his time between Signal Corps duties and a position on the G3 operations staff as their communications and code specialist, where he shared an office with Hugh Drum. He was an observer at the battles of Chateau-Thierry, Cantigny, and the Second Battle of the Marne. It was during the summer of 1918, on July 12th to be exact, that Hitt first met William Friedman when the men were walking down the street near AEF headquarters. Friedman had just arrived, a junior second lieutenant. His boss at Riverbank had tried to stop the army from taking him, but Friedman eventually prevailed and came to France and worked in the G2A6. Friedman wrote to his wife Elizabeth about the encounter with his idol and how flustered he was by the very tall man, Hitt was 6'4", who towered above him. They did not meet again till after the war. Hitt became the chief signal officer of the First Army when that army was formed. It was his idea to take 6 female telephone operators from AEF headquarters to First Army headquarters and have them work switchboards closer to the front. "Kiss your happy homes goodbye and get ready for a roving life," he told them. After the battle at Saint-Mihiel, Hitt was walking down the street one day with General Pershing when the men encountered several of the telephone operators. Pershing wanted to know if they were happy being so close to the front, and the women assured him that they wanted to be closer. Pershing told Hitt to take them where they wanted to go, but of course Hitt had already planned to do so. Hitt was also involved with 2 successful radio deception efforts that came after the Saint-Mihiel operation, one called the Lorraine Deception that took place in September 1918, and the other the 10th Army Deception during the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in October 1918. The latter was implemented by officers from the First Army's G2A6 and the signalmen from the Collection Service, which was subordinate to Hitt as Chief Signal Officer of the Army. Hitt remained in Europe until July 1919. Remember, he came over on the Baltic in 1917. After the armistice, he was tasked with numerous Signal Corps duties, including holding a spot on the Inter-Allied Radio Telegraphic Conference and another board related to the peace negotiations. He served on Pershing's Superior Board, one of only 2 non-general officers to do so, and spent a stint as the Chief Signal Officer of the Third Army in Koblenz, Germany. Though Russell very much encouraged Hitt to switch to the Signal Corps, he demurred, preferring to stay in the infantry, partly because he had a poor opinion of the technical skills and abilities of many of the higher-ranking signal officers, Russell excepted. Next slide, please. This is a photograph that's in the collection of the Army's Intelligence Center of Excellence at Fort Huachuca, which is little known until recently. It was probably set there by Mary Lou Hitt with some other material when she donated when Hitt was inducted into the MI Hall of Honor. It shows a party on October 20th, 1918 in Souy, France, in the offices of the Chief Signal Officer of the First Army, Hitt, marking multiple birthdays among Hitt's officers and the female telephone operators. Hitt sits at the far right of the shot. You can see him in profile. He supplied the signal flag decorations, and his men constructed the dome light, which was decorated with flags and celery leaves and small U.S. and French flags. Great pains were taken to make it a festive occasion. Food was brought from Paris, and they found the chef at the French aviation camp who would prepare it. There were menu cards with a little verse specific to each individual. That is what the woman in the front right is reading. I know it looks like she's glancing at her phone. They ate roast goose with stuffing and mushroom sauce and cauliflower, roast potatoes, lobster salad, caviar, fresh fruit, which was a change from the usual dried, celery, nuts, cheese, and cakes. I love the picture because it captures the atmosphere of festivity on what was a dreary, rainy day during a short pause in combat operations. The party is described in several of the telephone operators' diaries, and I was able to share the photo with Elizabeth Cobbs, the author of the book The Hello Girls, while she was doing her research. It's so nice to link up a picture with written accounts. Even when you have to do it a century later, you really get the feeling that you were there and you know what's going on. Next slide, please. This is a view of Lower Manhattan from Governor's Island in New York Harbor. After the war, Hitt became an instructor at the Army War College in Washington. Then at the end of January 1921, he began what is the most troublesome and controversial portion of his career. In his first assignment as a general staff officer, Hitt became Assistant Chief of Staff of Military Intelligence, G2, in the Second Corps Area Headquarters on Governor's Island in New York City. The United States was beset by unrest and perceived threats from labor activists, Bolsheviks, and African Americans in the year. The year 1919 was marked by race riots, strikes, and bombings. In September 1920, an explosion on Wall Street in front of the headquarters of J.P. Morgan, said to be the work of anti-capitalists, killed 30 and injured 300. You could hear the blast on Governor's Island. Duties for military intelligence officers in core areas were poorly defined, and the relationship between these officers and the Military Intelligence Division, the MID in Washington, was similarly unclear, creating an unfortunate situation for all involved. They used methods of investigation not designed for peacetime, and they became and remain controversial. The mission of this domestic military intelligence effort was to surveil not just foreign interests, but also those domestic organizations suspected of receiving support from hostile powers or threatening the stability of the U.S. government. The MID began targeting American minorities. Soviet Russia, the ongoing Russian Civil War, and the Communist Internationale were considered threats to the nation, and many American Jews belonged to domestic factions associated with the Internationale and were therefore targets of investigation. Organizations campaigning for civil rights for African Americans were also perceived as domestic threats, and many leaders of this movement were also targeted. In addition to domestic surveillance, a good deal of Hitt's intelligence work involved the activities of foreign nations. He personally gathered information at social events and tasked the Bureau of Investigation's New York office to conduct subsequent surveillance. When Hitt received guidance from the MID, he did his best to satisfy Washington's request. He implemented orders to surveil domestic organizations and individual citizens. The ever-frugal Hitt, whose office had limited funding, was always careful to request reimbursement from the MID for the books and subscriptions he procured for them. Budget issues plagued him throughout his tour, and by July there was no money for investigations or subscriptions. Hitt's office also handled the MID allotments that paid the salaries of some of the employees of Herbert O. Yardley's Black Chamber, which was operating in Manhattan under cover of a private code-making company, though Hitt apparently had no personal association with Yardley while in New York. The expenses of this office were split between the State Department and the Army. Hitt's 6 months of MID service should be neither minimized nor exaggerated. In hindsight, the Army's monitoring of domestic minority groups was clearly an infringement of civil rights. Time has also uncovered the extent of racism and anti-Semitism in the Army. Hitt, who was a free-thinking, principled man with broad experience, apparently did not share these views. His greatest prejudice, I found, were against inefficiency and incompetence. In July 1921, he was reassigned as a War College instructor. There's no indication that the move was due to a request on Hitt's part or any dissatisfaction with his work at the MIT, and indeed, the Hitts were sorry to leave their nice house on Governor's Island and access to life in Manhattan, where one of his brothers was working. Once again, happenstance made the man famous for something outside his declared area of expertise, the infantry. Next slide, please. This picture was taken in France in 1919, near the time of Hitt's service on the Superior Board. But it was appropriate. After the G2 job in New York, Hitt returned to the War College, and then he was sent to the 23rd Infantry at Fort Sam Houston, and then he came back to Washington in the General Staff. He retired from the Army in 1928 after 30 years of service. As I researched Hitt, these two questions struck me about his Army career. Why did he not attain the rank of general, and, in that same vein, could he have become chief signal officer? I've concluded Hitt was not really promotion or advancement driven. He always did his best, and he almost always received superior evaluations for his work, but he does not appear to have been a political animal, and he was not always looking towards the next and better assignment, unlike most of his peers. Early in his career, he pursued assignments that would interest him, and the Army quickly began to take advantage of his technical skills. And critically, he lacked a well-placed sponsor or mentor. Pershing submitted him for promotion to brigadier general twice in late 1918, and had the war not ended in November, he probably would have been promoted to that rank, though certainly demoted again upon return home, which happened to him anyway. He very explicitly told his wife, "If anyone hands me any stars, I will grab at them. I hate money, but we have to have it to get along." Had Hitt given in to Edgar Russell's campaign to have him switch from infantry to the Signal Corps, it seems entirely possible he would have been promoted at some point and been in line to be chief signal officer, as were his war colleagues George Gibbs and Irving Carr, who Hitt outranked during the war, and his fellow instructor from the signal school, Joseph O. Maubourne, later became chief signal officers as well. A move to the Signal Corps might have allowed Hitt to advance through merit rather than politics, but he seems to have been infantry to the core, and he had a degree of disdain for the skills of most of the Signal Corps officers, other than Russell and Gibbs and Maubourne, as well as a negative view of the then current Chief Signal Officer, George Squire. Next slide, please. I'm running a little long, but bear with me. Even before his terminal leave was finished, Hitt was hired by his old World War I assistant, Sosthenes Bean, who owned and operated the International Telephone and Telegraph Company, IT&T. Here, Hitt undertook a variety of cipher-related tasks, including development of a rotor-based machine. This is one of his patent drawings. IT&T wanted to sell this machine to the U.S. government, but during evaluation tests in November 1931, it was successfully broken by none other than William Friedman and his team at the new Signal Intelligence Service. Hitt's reaction was, quote, amazement and awe, and he asked permission to congratulate Friedman's team. Frank Rowlett, one of the young mathematicians at the time who worked for Friedman and a renowned cryptologist, wrote, when we had assembled, Colonel Hitt made a short and somewhat formal speech of congratulations, in which he stated that while he was disappointed that his invention did not offer the high degree of security that he had expected of it, he was personally gratified to learn the War Department had developed a cryptanalytic capability powerful enough to solve in such a short time a cipher machine that he had considered impregnable. Rowlett continued, Hitt must have felt a great disappointment at having his invention prove to be unsatisfactory in such a short time, but he never let it show for an instant. Now, interestingly, the plans for this machine were shared with IT&T's German subsidiary, the Lawrence Company, and Hitt's machine became an early predecessor of the Lawrence machine we now know by its nickname Tunny, which was used to encipher high-level communications of the Third Reich. Hitt's machine and its work also contributed to Friedman's thought process and development of what became the successful U.S. cipher device known as SIGABA, which, as far as we know, was never broken by an adversary. Next slide, please. A health crisis in early 1932, combined with financial troubles at IT&T during the Depression, left Hitt retired again that year. He could not find permanent work, but engaged in a variety of activities, including working with the American Cryptogram Association, writing, and other hobbies. In September 1939, he requested to return to active duty in the Army, and in the fall of 1940, he was assigned to be the Chief Signal Officer of the 5th Corps area at Fort Hays in Columbus, Ohio. The picture on the left was taken at this time. In the autumn of 1943, Hitt, now a year older than the mandatory Army retirement age of 64, retired again. Mary Lou Hitt went to work at Arlington Hall Station as a code girl in 1944. Hitt attended the inauguration of his old friend Eisenhower in 1953 and maintained a regular correspondence with Friedman, who is now a senior executive at the National Security Agency. He continued to invent. Genevieve died in 1963, just before David Kahn began visiting Hitt to gather material for the Codebreakers. In February 1971, the 92-year-old Hitt fell and broke his hip. He died in the hospital on March 2, 1971, with Mary Lou by his side. Next slide, please. And I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit about Mary Lou. Mary Louise Hitt, always called Mary Lou, was born in 1912 in San Antonio, Texas. Genevieve had gone home to give birth under the supervision of her father, who was a doctor with an obstetrics practice. Parker took leave from his teaching duties to be there and suggested that her cradle be put in his study where he could rock her while listening to his radio set while Genevieve slept. The picture on the upper right shows Parker and Mary Lou, and you see Mary Lou is wearing a headset to listen to the radio. She called her parents Parker and Gigi, which was Genevieve's nickname, rather than father and mother, and had a rather free-willing childhood. She was devoted to her parents and lived with them until their deaths. On the lower left, the picture shows 6-year-old Mary Lou on a Harley Davidson at Fort Sam Houston in 1918. And if you can see, look closely, there's a doll stuck in the handlebars. In the fall of 1944, Mary Lou, who had worked for the Army while in Columbus, Ohio, wanted to return to work, so Parker called William Friedman on the evening of October 23, 1944, to see if he had a place for Mary Lou, and then a little over 2 weeks later, on November 9th, even before the background investigation and paperwork had been done, she was sworn in at Arlington Hall Station. Friedman summoned her to tea a month later and showed her Parker's original sliding strip device, discussed Friedman's Voynich manuscript study group, and they gossiped about Herbert O. Yardley. Though Mary Lou received the highest ratings, she did not stay on after the surrender of Japan and returned home to look after Genevieve, who was ill. Later in life, she helped to organize Parker's papers to send to David Kahn, some of them, and kept a correspondence with cryptologic enthusiast Louis Crew. And she worked to preserve her parents' legacy. She died in 1997. Not last slide, almost the next slide. Was Friedman correct in his assessment of Hitt? Friedman first learned of Hitt when he read Hitt's manual. He used the book to train officers in late 1917 and early 1918. He had hoped to meet Hitt in early 1917, but instead met with Genevieve, as Hitt was en route to France. Friedman and Hitt met in Chaumont, France, in the summer of 1918, when Friedman was a newly arrived second lieutenant in the G2A6, and Hitt was on the verge of becoming CSO of the First Army. Friedman hero-worshipped Hitt and looked for every opportunity to seek his opinions and advice. Friedman witnessed, albeit at a slight distance and sometimes secondhand, the influence Hitt had on the three-part AEF Cryptologic organization. At the time, the men running these organizations did not realize they were devising the principles of a future American cryptologic system. Many collection of analytic principles developed for the AEF organizations can be seen in later American cryptologic work. Friedman had arrived late and stayed late, was responsible for gathering up the work done at the G2A6 in France, and he spent years cultivating the memory of the radio intelligence system of the AEF. He used the organization of AEF Cryptology and the lessons learned there when he set up the Signal Intelligence Service for the Army in 1930. This Army organization later became the Signal Security Agency, and then the Army Security Agency was folded into the Armed Forces Security Agency in 1949 and is thus the direct predecessor of the National Security Agency. was created in 1952. Hitt, while rarely directly involved in most aspects of World War I cryptology, nonetheless heavily influenced and guided the work, and this is what Friedman remembered and commemorates in his 1957 inscription. And who am I to quarrel with Friedman's assessment? And next slide. Just threw this in. My long-delayed book, which was written in 2018, From the Ground Up, American Cryptology During World War I, was released by NSA's Center for Cryptologic History last year. It's in PDF on the NSA website, and if you write to history@nsa.gov, you can get a print copy as well. Hitt was a small but critical player in this story, and the book covers cryptologic operations across the U.S. military on the home front and in France, a subject that has not previously been addressed in much depth.
Thank you for watching our Writing Awards series. If you like this episode, please click like and subscribe. You can also find more Army history and support the Foundation at our website at www.armyhistory.org. Thank you.